Welcome, everyone, to Money Growth and Inflation. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started, shall we? Do you wish you had $1,000,000? Because I sure as hell do. In fact, I bet everyone would be happy with another $1,000,000. And for a majority of us, if we had $1,000,000, we would all be rich, at least richer. And what would you do if you had $1,000,000? What would you do with it? Well, if I had $1,000,000, I would pay off all of my student loans. I'd buy a really fun new car. I'd get a nicer apartment or, buy a really nice house. I'd probably buy a couple of guitars, go on a few vacations, because why the hell not? And I might even buy some fancy Dijon mustard and, ketchup, just because I could. I would take limousines everywhere because it costs more. I would have a lot of fun with $1,000,000. But what would happen if everybody got $1,000,000? Let's say that somebody gets in a helicopter with boatloads of cash and flies overhead, dropping all of that cash over every household in America. Well, if that happened, we would have our famed helicopter drop of money, which is used as a thought experiment in monetary economics. And this isn't really too far off, at least in basic theory, from what former FOMC chair Ben Bernanke did in 2008. In response to the financial crisis in that year, the Federal Reserve engaged in quantitative easing, which is a form of unconventional monetary policy targeted at reducing yields on long-term Treasury and mortgage-backed securities to try to stabilize economic fluctuations. When you want to reduce these yields, you got to buy a lot of them up. So what the Fed did was they bought over $3 trillion worth of Treasury and mortgage-backed securities. This is unfairly labeled as like a cash handout or bailouts to the banks, but it's honestly much more complicated than that because the initial goal was just to satisfy money demand. The long-term goal was to try to prevent inflation from becoming deflation because during an economic recession, deflation is not exactly a good thing. And additionally, they also wanted to, prevent GDP from falling. They wanted to keep, unemployment get unemployment low because it was at a pretty high point when they started engaging in this type of policy. But recall that at the zero lower bound, money demand approaches infinity. All right, we learned this when we did the money in the utility function model a few lectures ago. So when interest rates are cut by a central bank in response to an economic downturn, you're going to end up with an increased demand for money. And if you want to meet that demand for money, well, you've got to engage in some kind of large-scale asset purchases in order to actually satisfy that demand for money. So in theory, at least somewhat, the Fed actually did do the right thing. And we'll be getting a little bit further into that, into why I said it only worked somewhat in theory within, I think, probably the next 4 or 5 lectures. We can kind of get into that stuff. But if we all got $1,000,000, what would happen? Well, you wouldn't be the only person who wants all of these really nice things like planes, trains, automobiles, and fancy ketchup. No, you'd be one among millions who all of a sudden think they can afford all of these new and super nice things. Now, I say think because as everybody gets a huge deposit of money into their accounts, but no new goods or services are being made, then prices are going to rise to meet the new demand that has just been created. And what would happen when everybody starts wanting to buy new things? I may want a new season of The Orville. It would have to be crowdfunded because I don't think $1,000,000 could even fund one single episode, let alone, an entire season 4. But maybe a lot of people also want new episodes of, say, Dexter to retcon what happened at the end of New Blood. Maybe people want to raise a bunch of money to buy Alex Kurtzman out of his contract to run Star Trek with Paramount and get somebody good in there so he can stop ruining Star Trek for a damn change. But all of these things cost money. And when there's more money in circulation but no new things, then prices have to increase. So in order to really analyze this question, to be able to answer it effectively, we've got to make a couple of assumptions, as we always do. First, we want to assume everyone has access to complete and perfect information, meaning no one knows something that someone else doesn't, and everything is known with certainty. We also want to assume perfect competition in the markets, so no one has any monopoly power over the market, and we'll also be assuming that prices can respond to shocks instantaneously. Now, we also want to assume that everybody got all the money at once, because if, say, some people get the money but not others, then, well, you get kind of like lopsided behavior, and this is actually where you can tend to see more real effects. But I want to get to the nominal effects before we start touching on what the real effects of these things could be. So everybody gets all the money at once, and they all go to the stores to buy everything they want. But these stores know everyone got a ton of money, and they really have no additional stuff to sell other than what is currently on the shelves. So what do? Well, they can either sell everything at the existing price and have a lot of angry people wanting more stuff, or we can make the assumption that markets will clear, thus achieving equilibrium, and these firms are going to raise their prices. So just from this little example, we can see prices really aren't anything more than a rationing mechanism. The price is adjusted such that those who are willing and able to pay for a good or service are willing and able to pay for the good or service. So what would eventually happen is that everybody just raises prices. Every store is going to raise their price in response to this huge demand shock. No one's going to sell more stuff than what they were selling before, because nobody made any more stuff in response to this shock. Nobody buys any more stuff than what they were buying before. Everybody's going to have the same standard of living. Prices are just higher, because if nothing new gets made and everybody gets this massive injection of money, well, you've increased the nominal quantity of money, but you have not increased the real quantity of money. And with no increases in the real quantity of money, standards of living aren't going to increase. Why is that? Well, it's because money's a nominal variable. It's not a real variable. So if you were to increase the money supply, you're increasing a nominal variable. And because we assume that markets were perfectly competitive and that prices were perfectly flexible, any change in the money stock isn't going to affect real economic variables like output, unemployment, etc. If we want to look at, say, M2, which is, the most commonly used measure of the money supply, and compare that to the core PCE index, this is what we would get. Now, I've got them in natural log form, so the scale is relatively similar. And if we were to plot them out, as I do here, we can see that they both follow some kind of an upward trend. Now, it is pretty obvious that after about the early to mid 1980s, right, the core PCE index kind of flattened out a little bit, whereas the growth rate, or as M2, not the growth rate, the level of M2 has more or less stayed on its original trend. So there's a little bit of a deviation after the 1980s, but we can see that for the most part, they are following this upward trend. So there's probably at least some correlation between money and the price level. All right, let's look at money and real GDP, again in natural log form. Well, if we've got real GDP in the purple, money in blue, well, they're kind of following, they're both following an upward trend. Now here, the reason they're following an upward trend could be that they are simply following different upward trends, right? The trend that is driving the growth in money may not be the trend that's driving the growth in real GDP, right? Why would there be a different trend behind real GDP? Well, real GDP, one of the things that's driving that trend is the underlying technological advancements that occur on, honestly, an almost like constant basis. All right, there's constantly innovation occurring within GDP growth. It's one of the reasons why there's this trend in GDP. But, innovation isn't really something that's going to be driving money growth, at least innovation in the same way. So there could be different underlying trends between money and real GDP, but we can see that they are correlated somewhat. Money and nominal GDP, on the other hand, very different story. They're very closely correlated, much more so than money and real GDP. Now, why do we think that would be? Well, remember, real GDP has netted out the effect of price changes over time. So you're allowing the quantity to change over time, but the price is remaining constant, right? Fixed price, variable quantity. Here we've got variable price, variable quantity. The price, it is the current period price at every single period at which nominal GDP is observed here. So if we were to plot out a nominal variable with a nominal variable, wouldn't be too surprising that at least for these two nominal variables, we would have a high correlation. Because if we want to go with the baseline hypothesis that I'm sure you can have netted out from this lecture thus far, if there is a change to money growth, there is probably going to be a change to inflation. So if you change the money stock over time, then you'll be changing prices over time. And since nominal GDP uses current prices, right, for say 1990, it's using 1990 quantity and 1990 prices. 2000, it's 2000 quantity and 2000 prices. So if you are changing the money supply, you're probably going to be having an effect on the price level. Therefore, there's going to be more correlation between money and nominal GDP than there is between money and real GDP. So, is there anything that we can get out of that? Well, aside from what I told you earlier, yes. Because we can see M2 is at least somewhat correlated with prices, real GDP, and nominal GDP, but nominal GDP is more correlated with M2 than real GDP, right? The correlation between M2 and real GDP is about 0.92. Correlation between M2 and nominal GDP is 0.96. Now, you're probably like, well, that's not much more correlated. But I'm willing to bet if we were to have removed these trends, right, if we flattened out this behavior, we removed the underlying trends, I would be very willing to bet that the correlation between M2 and real GDP is much, much less than 0.92. So like I said, these high correlations can be driven by common trends. They can also be driven by different trends. So intuitively, it would make some sense that nominal GDP and M2 would be highly correlated, and M2 and real GDP would not be as correlated. Because if our hypothesis here is correct, money isn't going to be doing much to real variables, only nominal variables. So because M2 is nominal and NGDP, or nominal GDP, is also nominal, they should be more correlated with each other than with real GDP, which is what we saw in the previous graph. But what about money growth and inflation? Because I talked about the money level and the price level, but what about the growth rate of money and the growth rate of prices? How are these different than the level of M2 and the level of prices? Well, if I get the percent changes in M2 and percent changes in the price level, what I get is the growth rate of money and the growth rate of prices, or the inflation rate. And it gives me this right here. Now, I've plotted out money growth and inflation from 2019 up to 2022 rather than, was it like 1970 or 1960 something? Because honestly, this is where some of the more really interesting stuff starts to show up. But these rates are printed out here as a percent change from a year ago. So it's not the percent change from, say, this quarter and the previous quarter. It's percent change from this quarter 1 year ago. So if it's fourth quarter of 2022, which it's not quite, almost there, but not quite, fourth quarter of 2022, I would be comparing it to the fourth quarter of 2021 rather than the third quarter of 2022. And when I plot out money growth and inflation this way, this is what we see. Okay, well, that's cool, but does it tell us anything? Like, does printing more money cause inflation? Well, it's not really telling us that. It's not to say that the information isn't there. It's just by eyeballing the data, maybe it's a little bit more tricky than that. So we can look at it. Okay, well, if the red line is the inflation rate. Now we can see that the inflation rate ticks up sometime around 2021, and it seems to tick up a good bit relative to what the inflation rate was before that. But that happens as the money growth is beginning to slow down. So you'd be like, well, money growth and inflation don't seem to be that correlated, because if the growth rate of money is slowing and inflation is increasing, that doesn't make any sense. Isn't that like counterintuitive? Isn't that like the exact opposite of what you've been telling us this entire lectures, the entire 15 minutes and 37 seconds that I've been talking? So maybe we need something a little bit more advanced than just eyeballing data. Fortunately for us, we can use a Granger causality test. What is a Granger causality test? Well, let's have story time with Jeremy. This isn't an econometrics course. I want to make that painfully clear before I go any further. So you're not going to have to know what this stuff is, in the sense of you're not going to have to recreate what I'm about to show you. You're not going to have to run any code to run a Granger causality test or do any time series analysis. Well, you have to do a little time series in this course, but nothing substantial. So you don't have to know how to run a Granger causality test. And I don't want to bore you with a super long explanation, so I'm going to give you a super long explanation that's hopefully not boring, where you don't have to do any of this stuff on your own, but I'll be doing it so you can see what happens here. The idea of a Granger causality is taking lags of two variables, and it's going to see if the lag of one time series is affecting current values of another time series. So in the context of what we just saw with money growth and inflation, it's going to say maybe contemporary values of money growth aren't affecting contemporary values of inflation, but perhaps lagged values of money growth are affecting current values of inflation. Thus, if I change the money growth rate today, inflation may not change today. It may change a year down the road, 6 months down the road, 18 months down the road, whenever it is. It won't hit immediately. It will change, but it won't happen right now. So with asking, do previous values of money growth affect current values of inflation, the idea would be the money supply changes sometime in the past. Will it be affecting inflation today? And the Granger causality test can tell us that. So we use this test, which is just a linear regression. So if any of you have taken statistics before and you remember linear regressions, that's what we're doing. We're actually using two linear regressions in this case, but still linear regression. So here's what we do. We estimate an equation for money, which is a function of lags of money and lagged inflation. So I've got two lags of inflation, two lags of money. So it's saying money is a function, right? Today's value of money is a function of yesterday's or last quarter's value of money growth times whatever this relationship is between lagged money growth and current money growth. What it was 2 quarters ago times what that relationship is between money growth from 2 quarters ago and money growth today. But it's also a function of what inflation was 1 quarter ago and what inflation was 2 quarters ago. Now, because we're estimating this relationship and there's never any perfect fit between an estimate, or there's never a perfect fit of an estimate, right? There's always going to be some residual, I don't want to call it measurement error because it's not quite measurement error. Think of it as error. So that's what that epsilon is. So money growth today is a function of what money growth has been for the last 2 quarters and what inflation has been for the last 2 quarters. But that's not enough. I can't have just this one equation, because that one equation is telling me part of the story, but it's not even directly answering the question I want to answer. The question I really want to answer is what happens to inflation given previous values of money growth. So inflation today is a function of what money growth was last quarter times the relationship between money growth from last quarter and inflation today. It's also a function of what money growth was 2 quarters ago times the relationship of what money growth was 2 quarters ago and today. But it's also a function of lagged values of inflation. So inflation today is at least somewhat dependent on what inflation was yesterday and what it was 2 periods ago or 2 quarters ago, because we're using quarterly data here. So this is basically saying past behavior predicts current behavior. And what I want to do is I want to see if the coefficients on the lags of money growth in the second equation, right, that alpha 2.1 and alpha 2.2, the blue coefficients, I want to see if they're statistically significantly different from 0, because that's going to tell me some interesting stuff. So if I can conclude that these two coefficients are not equal to 0, right, it's really more likely that they're going to be greater than 0. We'll see why in a second. Then we can say that money growth Granger causes inflation. Intuitively, it would mean that if Helicopter Ben gave us all $1 million yesterday, we would have high inflation as a result today. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have to use an F-test on these coefficients because it's a joint test. It's not just like an individual test on these things. So if any of you are stats nerds and are like, hey, what kind of test do we use? Well, we use an F-test. So it's a joint test on the estimated lagged money growth coefficients to see if those two together Granger cause inflation. So I run the test. I get an F-stat of 5.79. The p-value on that is really, 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 really small. So I tested at the 1% level of significance because that 0.00002935 is less than 0.01. Given our degrees of freedom, all that fun stuff, we've got a very statistically significant value of that F-stat, which implies that money growth Granger causes inflation. Now, we also want to make sure we can test the reverse to make sure that inflation isn't Granger causing money growth. So I test the coefficients alpha 1.2, alpha 1.3, the pink coefficients in the first equation that we saw, the lagged value of inflation on money growth. And I want to see if that's statistically significant as well. Well, it's also significant, or if it's significant, then there's some evidence of some hardcore reverse causality. What do I mean by that? Well, it kind of becomes a question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. So I test it, and I get a value that's significant, but it's not significant at the 1% level. It's significant at the 5% level. So if you want to be like super stat snobby and say, I'm only going to take things that are significant at the 1% level, then using that level as the cutoff, I can say that money growth, Granger causes inflation. However, inflation is not Granger causing money growth. But it is interesting, though, that it's still significant at the 5% level, which implies inflation might Granger cause money growth. But if we think about it intuitively, it would also make sense that there would be some kind of a significant relationship between them, because if inflation gets too high, the central bank wants to cut down on money growth to try to curb inflation. And that's actually what we've been seeing in the recent months / year now, well, almost a year, when the Federal Reserve has begun tapering their asset purchases and they're trying to raise interest rates because inflation is just getting totally out of control. So they'll look at inflation and go, hey, inflation's getting a bit high. We probably need to cut money growth a little bit. So if I were to write out the coefficient estimates of the equations that I specified, I'm only going to be showing the first lags just for simplicity. This is what we would get. There's a negative relationship between lagged inflation and current values of money growth. And there's a positive relationship between lagged money growth and current values of inflation. Lagged inflation, an increase in inflation, will lead to a drop in money growth tomorrow. So if we're looking at money growth today, this quarter, if inflation were up last quarter, if inflation was high, then the central bank goes, okay, maybe we want to try to reduce money growth a little bit. And when we went through our lecture on the Taylor rule, right, where we saw, there was an inflation target. If inflation got too high, they wanted to raise interest rates. Well, if they want to raise interest rates, what they're doing is they are affecting the quantity of money by slowing the growth rate of the quantity of money. So that negative relationship in equation 3 intuitively makes perfect sense. And in equation 4, lagged money growth leads to an increase in inflation, which also makes sense because if you are increasing the quantity of money and there are no additional goods or services being produced, then when you increase the quantity of money, inflation is going to have to rise because it's a rather simple, however eloquent, description of inflation that it is too many dollars chasing too few goods. If you have a lot of money but no additional goods being produced, well, that is a way that you can generate inflation. So if you increase the growth rate of money, you'll be increasing the growth rate of prices. So when we look at equations 3 and 4, these estimates make perfect sense, the pink and the blue. Absolutely perfect sense. So we had a big question, and that question was, does money growth cause inflation? We looked at it the best way we could using a statistical test, and we found that money likely causes inflation. But remember, a statistical test can't prove anything to us. It can only provide evidence to support a hypothesis. We never prove anything in statistics. Now, in terms of what the theory tells us, money growth causing inflation makes sense because there's theory behind this, right? We don't just have hard statistical evidence. We also have theory to back up the evidence. It helps us provide a narrative. It helps us provide a story given the evidence that we see. If you print more money, you have more money chasing the same number of goods. And since price is a rationing mechanism, more money will mean higher prices. Now, if you have more money and more goods, prices won't change. But if you have more money and the same number of goods, prices will change. So when COVID hit in March of 2020, the Fed began buying a lot of Treasury and mortgage-backed securities. And they did this via the creation of excess reserves to the tune of about $3 trillion. They did this to support the financial sector, the idea being they needed to provide liquidity to financial institutions that were in pretty dire straits, because if those financial institutions went under, the whole economy would eventually go under. Maybe not the whole economy, but a good chunk of it. And the economy would be hurting for a while. It would essentially be another Great Depression. Or at least so they said. We can get into the actual necessity of it later, because in 2008, perhaps we could make the argument that we needed to provide liquidity to financial institutions, blah, blah, blah. 2020, on the other hand, was a totally different cause. And when you have a different cause that is affecting the economy, sometimes throwing the same policy at it isn't really going to do that great of a thing, right? So maybe this wasn't a super great move on the Fed's part, but maybe we can get into that a little bit later. They carried on this behavior until March of 2022 when they finally stopped their bond purchases. But there's a big problem that had started around early 2021. And see if you can spot it. Now, kind of a spoiler alert, I sort of gave it away earlier. I know, shame on me, whatever. But inflation began ticking up sometime around the first quarter or so of 2021. Right where that black line is. That's when inflation started. And it started about 9 months after the large asset purchases started. And there really are a lot of reasons for this. There was pent-up demand that hit in early 2021 when the vaccines rolled out. Because once people started getting vaccinated, they're like, okay, I don't need to stay cooped up anymore. I can go out and restart my life. So a lot of people go out. And, a lot of people were also getting stimmies at the time. Some people weren't spending it. But when they can finally leave their house, they go out and they spend their stimmies. When that happened, accommodative policy was really no longer needed. The vaccines came out, the economy was beginning to open, there really wasn't much of a need for accommodative monetary policy anymore. There were large government spending packages that ultimately got indirectly financed by the Federal Reserve via something what's known as monetizing the debt. We'll get into that a little bit later. But it all really comes down to the fact that monetary policy affects variables like inflation unemployment, etc., with long and variable lags. Namely, it affects inflation with long and variable lags, which means if they start extremely loose monetary policy now, it could take a significant amount of time to really start showing up in the inflation numbers. But now that the Fed's got a problem of high inflation, which peaked at 9.1%, which is insane, means that you're losing 9.1% of your purchasing power every year. So they started in 2020. You can see where this blue chart ticks up rapidly. That's when the asset purchases started. But it took a while before inflation really began picking up, right? It took almost a year before we started seeing it. Why is that? Well, like I said, monetary policy transmits through the economy with long and variable lags. So they can increase money growth today, but they won't have to pay the price of money growth. No pun intended there. They won't have to pay the price of money growth today. They'll do it in like a year when inflation begins to tick up. And as inflation begins to tick up, well, all of a sudden the Federal Reserve is like, oh boy, maybe we need to start cutting the growth rate of money. Now you're seeing here the growth rate of money is tapering off, but remember, these are base effects. So this is everything that you're seeing here is a percent change from a year previous. So percent change from a year ago is kind of telling us what's going on with like the shape of money growth and inflation here. So it's not like they're looking, it's slowing from a quarter ago, it's slowing from a year ago. So as the Fed started buying up large amounts of these assets, we could see that inflation was really picking up quite substantially. It took about a year to do it, but it ultimately peaked at 9.1%. Well, headline CPI peaked at 9.1%. But sadly, the jury's still out on whether it's actually peaked. I'm hoping it hasn't, because the Federal Reserve has really engaged in some extremely tight monetary policy measures trying to keep inflation down and get it back to their 2% long-run average goal. But we can see that money growth drives inflation, or at least appears to drive inflation. And that's the answer to the question that we posed at the beginning. So if Helicopter Ben gives all of us a bunch of money, what ends up happening is it increases prices. Thus, money growth causes inflation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. There will be more lectures coming shortly.